Hey there, this is Bill Judas of Armchair Arcade. Today I'll be taking a look at Atari's new Flashback III, which, despite the name, is actually the fourth major flashback system released. I reviewed the first Atari Flashback way back in 2004 when that was first released. Unfortunately, back then, Legacy Engineering Group was apparently only given 10 weeks to create the system from scratch, and therefore had no choice but to rely on a NES on a chip, which powered the product. Since the goal of the Flashback was to deliver both a plug-and-play Atari 2600 and 7800 experience, this was definitely too tall of an order for what amounted to a Nintendo Entertainment System clone. While the first Flashback clearly disappointed anyone remotely familiar with any of the 20 first-party 2600 and 7800 games it clumsily simulated, the upside was that it sold enough for Atari to order production of a Flashback II. This time, Legacy Engineering Group did have the time to do it right, and while they dropped all efforts to replicate the 7800 experience, they ended up developing what amounted to an Atari 2600 on a chip, whose high accuracy more than made up for the omission. Released in 2005, the Flashback 2 came with a mix of over 40 original, prototype, hacked, and homebrew Atari 2600 games. While the first Flashback was styled like a miniature 7800, the Flashback 2 was styled like a miniature Atari 2600 VCS, complete with simulated wood grain. As a bonus, the two included joysticks were pin-compatible with the originals, meaning they could be used on other systems that worked with Atari-style joysticks. I have the system right here. Let's see. This is the Flashback 2. Packaging for the Flashback 1 was fairly similar. You have the clear plastic shell, the system, the manual, and again, this became the gold standard, just like the Commodore 64 DTV did. See the Atari style joysticks, and the system itself, nice and small. Put that aside for now. Now, besides the pin-compatible joysticks, that also meant that it could use paddle controllers to play the hidden paddle games. This was in direct contrast to the first Flashback, which basically just converted the paddle games to make use of the joystick. And, you know, as anybody who plays these games knows, that's not the way you want to play paddle games. The Flashback 2 could also be hacked at a cartridge port, which, outside of a few relatively minor compatibility quirks, made it an ideal modern revision of the original Atari 2600 hardware, particularly since it had default composite video rather than that fuzzy RF output of the original. So, somewhere in the 2006 to 2008 time frame, Legacy Engineering Group was working on an Atari Flashback portable, but Atari chose not to release it for whatever reason. I don't know the exact details, but instead in 2010, Atari decided to release the Flashback 2 Plus, which was identical to the Flashback 2 with the latest internals, but it had a couple of game swaps and a few cosmetic variations. Perhaps this was an inventory clear out of some type, or the economics of a last run made sense, but whatever the details, Atari decided to go in a slightly different direction with their next new system, which was the Flashback 3, but this time instead of Legacy Engineering Group, this was spearheaded by AT Games, or AT Games. One of the downsides to the Flashback 2 and 2 Plus for Atari was clearly the cost involved in that custom Atari 2600 on a chip. AT Games got around this by essentially leveraging emulation software on a chip, which allows an off-the-shelf chip to be reprogrammed to act like an Atari 2600. This is not as accurate as the Flashback 2 or 2 Plus, but the implementation is close enough where, unlike the first Flashback, you can use paddle controllers on the Flashback 3 for the games that support them. But as you'll see later, that's not quite what it's cracked up to be. Anyway, the Flashback 3 design is very close in the way that it looks to the Flashback II Plus, and obviously the Flashback 2. So, real quick, this is the 2 Plus. As you can see, it's a very similar box to the 2. Again, really just cosmetic variations. The same type of joysticks and the same type of system design. Again, it has the pretty professional packaging. Now the Flashback 3, the box is a little less red, but it's still the same basic concept. You have the it doesn't have the plastic top, but it does have the poster, which I'll talk about in a second, which is apparently a limited edition poster. And I have it set up here, the same Atari style joysticks and the same type of look of the system, though again, I'll talk about it in a second. Different labels and such for the buttons, and a few omissions. So, for instance, they relabeled the reset button to start. Though clumsy in its implementation, requiring holding both the joystick's fire button and the console select button for a few seconds, the addition of pause functionality is a nice bonus. And speaking of the joysticks, the feel of both the Flashback 2 and 2 Plus joysticks was very similar to the original, with sticks with a somewhat stiff, short throw. While the Flashback 3 joysticks have a similar physical design, they probably use the same molds, the Flashback 3 stick is much looser and has a longer throw. I tend to err on the side of being a purist, but I can't say that I mind the change. It seems to control just as well, and even with the change. This time there are 60 games included. I'm not going to name them all, but you can see the list of all 60 on the written review companion to this video review. Despite the inability to hack in a cartridge port, the 60 games on a plug-and-play system, along with another set of Atari-compatible joysticks for those of us who still use and maintain classic systems, is an excellent value proposition at a list price of just $39.99. As a bonus, that limited edition Atari Poster is included, though I'm told it will change from what's included in my at-game supplied review unit due to licensing irregularities. It's not a particularly interesting poster as these things go, but it's still a nice bonus. With all this in mind, the Flashback 3 has the foundation for a real winner, but it all comes down to how the games play. Unlike the previous Flashbacks that had their games accessible from categorized menus, the Flashback 3 is just one big list of games broken into consecutive pages, which some may prefer instead of trying to remember what games are in what category. As you scroll through each game title, you see a screenshot from the game, which is a nice touch, and it also clearly indicates whether a game is single or two-player, which is a big help for those of us who can't remember what's what throughout 60 games. Instead of trying to show you all 60 Atari 2600 games on the Flashback 3, you've probably seen it countless times before, I decided to pick 3 games from 3 different decades and compare them to what is shown on the Flashback 2 Plus. Obviously, this also limits me to picking 3 that appear on both. For instance, a good test of the Flashback 3 would have been Quad Run from 1983, which features speech and gave early releases of the Flashback 2 some trouble. But that's not included on the 3, so I can't do it. That omission is a bit odd, and it does make you wonder how capable the Flashback 3 actually is at replicating the full Atari 2600 experience. So it's certainly something to keep in mind. Also, both Flashbacks caused no end of issues with my capture equipment. I tried 2 different types, and I had the same results. The issue is probably how the Atari games trick the display to see some of the effects. This translates to missing graphics in some of the captures that are present when viewed on a regular display. I'll try to point it out when I edit the video together. Anyway, this is something to keep in mind when playing the Flashback II on a newer television, because there's a chance that it may not display the way that it's supposed to. So just keep that in mind. The first game is the 1979 action and adventure classic, Adventure, a game that features one of the best known early Easter eggs. As you can tell from the video, it plays well on both the 2 Plus and the 3. The second game is Yar's Revenge from 1982, often cited as one of the best games for the platform. The video clearly shows that the colorful game plays well on both the 2 Plus and the 3. The North American NTSC version of Save Mary was completed by late 1989 and scheduled for a 1990 release, with a PAL conversion for Europe completed in 1991. It too didn't see release, so officially it's a prototype. Nevertheless, Save Mary is a good example of a final generation first-party Atari title, and as you can tell from the video, plays well on both the 2 Plus and 3, though I do notice some variances between the two. For instance, with Mary moving slower on the 3. In this case, the experience does seem better on the 2 Plus. As a final test, I wanted to see how the paddle games worked with real paddles. The game I chose was Atari's 1981 coin-op conversion, Super Breakout. I did try a few others, but that's the one here. I simply selected the game, unplugged joystick 1, and plugged in the paddles. Naturally, it should work much better with the paddles than with the joystick, but even trying 3 different sets of paddles, I just couldn't get it to respond properly. Perhaps there's some trick or some code to make it work properly, but for my tests, they don't seem to. The paddle games are tuned nicely for the joysticks, but they still would play much better with proper paddle support. If I find something out about better paddle support, I'll update the written review. So in the end, what do I think of the Flashback 3? My intention with this review was not to see how perfect the Flashback 3 was in terms of emulating the Atari 2600, but to see if it was noticeably different from what I remember of an Atari 2600 through normal play, and of course how well it avails itself against the recent 2 Plus. They're basically only a year apart. In both regards, it avails itself well. If you can find the system for the $39.99 or less that it retails for, go for it. If you want a nice 60-game plug-and-play Atari 2600 collection, this is a very easy way to do it. And you can consider the new Atari style, the new Atari style joysticks as a nice bonus if you have compatible systems lying around. If you already own one of the previous Flashback 2s, you should really take note of the difference in game selections and whatnot, because the 2s do seem to do a better job overall. Regardless of your purchasing decision, at least none of us have to deal with another Flashback 1 type of situation, and that's, and for most of us that's good enough. Hopefully now that there's 4 of these things released by Atari, they can move on from the 2600 and start to leverage some of their other historical platforms, like the Atari 8-bit computer line. I won't be holding my breath, but I suppose if a similarly low-cost emulator on a chip situation can be implemented, I guess there's always a chance. My conclusion, this is worth buying, but definitely pay attention to those caveats. Until next time, this is Bill Judas for Armchair Arcade.